You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Castor and Ranking Member Graves. Ms. Tezak, if the government right now mandated that we had to shut down all coal plants to move to renewables, how much would that cost?
We haven't actually fully modeled that in its entirety. We did take a look at the proposal that Mayor Bloomberg had suggested with shutting down the coal plants by 2030. And on an equipment basis alone, not including transmission upgrades, not including financing, just on swapping out all of those coal assets for an even split of solar, wind, and, to Mr. Carter's interest, biomass. With the necessary storage to balance intermittency, we got to $941 billion.
Well, I've gotten to over $1 trillion.
Yes, but by the time you put financing and transmission in and potentially residual costs for abandoned assets, easily.
How much do you think it would cost to finance it?
Well, in our theoretical, if you put a 1 cent per kilowatt hour surcharge on every kilowatt delivered in the U.S. last year, you'd raise about $34 billion towards that.
Yeah. Given that the total spending in 2017 for electricity in West Virginia for residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation was only $2 billion, that would be a huge cost burden to my constituents, wouldn't you say?
I would say that based on the analysis we provided in our testimony, it would weigh most heavily on your constituents.
It would. Could you elaborate on how transitioning to renewables would impose further costs on consumers?
Well, I think it's a matter of pace and exactly what you want to achieve. But more importantly, it's pace. The more accelerated the timeline, the more compressed and limited your options are. So to the extent that it took several years for cost declines to materialize in solar and wind, which they did, in no small part because in spite of federal support, natural gas became cheap as well. And so the competitive nature forced the cost direction down. That occurred over time. Mm-hmm. And so very quick action can sometimes limit the ability to make use of cost declines that that appear over time. For example, the R&D that Catherine has mentioned, that's going to take a little time to develop. If we find chemical solutions that take our reliance off rare earth minerals so that we have something else that's available domestically, that may not be available on the same timeline that is foreseen, for example, under Mayor Bloomberg's thing. So I think that you lose some economic benefit. Plus, you have to reconcile the fact that you may have assets out there that you're still paying for. For example, in PG&E's bankruptcy, there's a question about whether or not they can reject early stage, some of the first renewable projects that were out there because simply on a cost basis. So do you abandon those folks who brought you forward at the beginning? It's a very difficult set of equities to balance.
It is a very difficult set. In West Virginia in 2017, coal-fired electric plants accounted for 93% of my state's electricity. Renewables, mostly hydroelectric and wind, accounted for 4.6%, and natural gas provided the remaining 2.2%. This isn't just West Virginia. Nationwide, wind, solar, geothermal, and hydroelectric power only constituted 6% of consumption of energy in 2017. Do we need more renewable energy? Absolutely yes. Is it realistic that we will keep our homes, businesses, schools powered reliably without coal and natural gas? Absolutely not. We need to be focused on innovation, like real carbon capture that can make a real difference in protecting our environment. Ms. Hamilton, I appreciated your reference to Appalachian roots and the term thoughtful, because thoughtful is very, very important. So is supply and demand. We need to consider the economic consequences of what this committee is considering. I want my colleagues to understand that a few years ago, my constituents were left with the results of bad policy, of mandates which picked winners and losers without letting the market decide. There is a place for all forms of energy, but it cannot come at the expense of jobs and livelihoods and entire communities being wiped out. Electricity bills skyrocketed, which left many peoples with fixed incomes choosing between food and medicine and keeping their heat and lights on. My state and Mr. Palmer's state of Alabama are amongst the top 5 energy exporters in the United States and have to backfill all of the grids in states like California, which is the #1 energy importer at nearly 90 million megawatt hours per year. My state's total export of energy could power every household and business in Orange and San Diego County for the entire year. Ms. Tezak, we have 50 states in this country with different needs and different weather patterns. What is needed in Hawaii won't necessarily be needed in Florida or New Hampshire. Can you discuss the pitfalls of a top-down approach of applying aggressive renewables, schemes, and mandates across all the 50 states?
And I'm sorry, the gentlewoman's time has expired, but we are going to encourage you to answer that for the record. And at this time, we recognize Mr.